finding out who should lead a country. Unless the only qualification for being the leader of a country that matters is winning an election. Which is definitely a road you could go down. The philosopher John Stuart Mill thought that the proper function of a representative government is not to actually lead the nation. It's not to be the experts on how to solve everybody's problems. It's to invest the experts with the moral authority to act, to keep the keys to power on behalf of the people. On that understanding, moral expertise and training could certainly be helpful, but the most important thing is that you win an election, so long as that election represents the people's will. And we will come back to that. In addition, we in the 21st century might be a little bit more skeptical about whether educating somebody to be a ruler could ever be fair or unbiased. Because who gets to decide what the future rulers will be taught is going to hold the real power. Information is never just neutral, because somebody has to arrange it. Just like I'm not really capable of educating people about Brexit in an unbiased way. Arguably nobody is. The information that I put out there comes through one frame, and if it gels with yours then great, but you might be approaching this whole thing from a completely different In 2016, Paramount Pictures released Arrival, a science fiction film directed by Denis Villeneuve based on the short novel Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. 12 alien ships arrive at various locations around Earth. They don't attack or make demands, they just open the doors and wait for humanity to introduce themselves. The problem is nobody can understand the alien language, so teams of scientists around the world start trying to communicate with them in a coordinated international effort. Amy Adams plays a linguist called Dr. Louise Banks, Jeremy Renner plays an astrophysicist named Ian Donnelly, and Forrest Whitaker is the army colonel who recruits them into the American team. This isn't going to be a review of the film per se, but if you haven't seen it, it is pretty good, and I'm going to spoil the ending. One of the themes of Arrival is communication between different worldviews or frameworks, and the possibility of multiple interpretations of the same thing depending on the framework from which somebody is operating. We get a great illustration of this in the first 12 minutes, and a nice character establishing moment for Louise when Colonel Weber first turns up at her office to ask for her help.
I'm Colonel G.T. Weber. We never formally met, but 2 years ago you did some Farsi translations for Army intelligence.
Hmm.
You made quick work of those insurgent videos.
You made quick work of those insurgents.
Just in case you missed the fact that Louise is approaching things through a different framework than the other characters, the film shows us again when we meet Donnelly.
How did they get here? Are they capable of fast and light travel? Are they, a list of questions that, go over, starting with a series of just a handshake binary sequences.
How about we just talk to them before we start throwing math problems at them?
The US Army builds a temporary military base near where one of the alien ships is parked over rural Montana. When Louise first arrives, she learns that some people find encountering the aliens such a shock to how they view the world that they become physically and mentally ill. Nevertheless, she and Donnelly begin trying to teach the aliens just enough English to ask the all-important question, why are you here? Just for fun, contrast Arrival with the 1997 film Contact starring Jodie Foster, which is also about trying to communicate with aliens and the different frameworks through which people approach the task. There, it's more about a religious framing versus a scientific one, and Contact's most famous line at the end of the film expresses the idea that maybe there's room for both.
Poetry. I should have said a poem.
So beautiful. Beautiful.
Mill actually had quite a complex relationship with democracy. On the one hand, he was a liberal and an early supporter of women's suffrage. He was a utilitarian, somebody who thinks that the best course of action is one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism is an ethical system rather than an explicitly political one, but it greatly informed his political work. He supported women's suffrage because By extending the right to vote, we hopefully make sure that everybody's interests get represented and nobody gets overlooked, and that should, fingers crossed, maximize happiness. On the other hand, though, Mill didn't think that democracy should be extended to barbarous races, and naturally, he was the one who got to separate the barbarians from the civilized folk. So he didn't think that Indians should be allowed to democratically run India, for instance, until Britain had taught them how to run India properly. And again, it was the British who were going to make the call about what it is to run a country properly. Mill thought that democracy was the best way of ensuring that everybody's interests get a fair shake. And one possible response to that, which his own attitude towards India kind of shows, is that it depends on how you do it. Mill himself acknowledges that you can have a bad system where not everybody can actually vote, and you can still call it democracy. Ancient Athens, birthplace of democracy, only men were allowed to vote. Moreover, the ancient Athenians discovered that involving the people in civil proceedings is pretty expensive, and one of the major sources of that cash was the Athenian Empire, i.e., all the people outside of Athens who very much had an interest in a stake in what went on there and which way the votes went, but who weren't allowed to participate. They didn't call it the Athenian Empire, though. They called it the Delian League, which was clever of them. You generally don't want to call yourself the Empire openly. It's pretty bad optics. The Americans don't, and their empire is doing pretty well at the moment. So when we in Britain talk about our democracy inheriting a lot from the ancient Greeks, we might be more right than we realize. Rather like ancient Athens, we call what we've got a democracy, but let's just pull on that thread. Lord Cromer described Britain as a democracy in 1908, despite the fact that half the population couldn't vote because they were women. He also praised democracy whilst being the unelected military dictator of Egypt. There are still about 93,000 adult British citizens in the UK today who are not allowed to vote. For comparison, that's slightly bigger than the average MP's constituency. And those people are called prisoners. Not to mention the several million folks who live here, work here, fall in love here, and whose interests are very much here, but who aren't allowed to vote here because they are alien. When Banks and Donnelly enter the spaceship, they make contact with two aliens who they nickname Abbott and Costello, after a pair of comedians whose most famous sketch is specifically about miscommunication and misunderstanding.
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
The humans decide to call the alien species heptapods, meaning 7 feet. There's some drama around framing when Louise learns that the Chinese team of scientists are using a game of mahjong to communicate with their heptapods, which could lead them to interpret all the answers they get as being within an aggressive, competitive win-or-lose framing. Through conversations with Abbott and Costello, the team learns that the written version of the alien language is semasiographic. It conveys meaning, but it does not represent sound, like emojis. The language is also non-linear. It doesn't have a forwards or a backwards. Louise brings up the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the language you use determines how you think, determines your framing. The strong version is that language determines your framing, the weak version is that language influences it. This raises the possibility that the heptapods might perceive even fundamental things like time very differently to humans. But Colonel Weber is concerned that the effort to communicate with the aliens is taking so long, and that his superiors are starting to worry they might be a threat. Louise tries to explain that they have to take it slow because even small miscommunications at the early stages can lead to big problems later on, by saying that when European colonizers first tried to ask Australian Aborigines what the name of the animal is that hops around and carries its young in a pouch, the Aborigines said kangaroo. And only later did the colonizers discover that kangaroo means I don't understand. Colonel Weber takes the point, but reminds her what happened next.
And remember what happened to the Aborigines? A more advanced race nearly wiped them out.
Again, reframing the effort to communicate within the context of competition and aggression. Louise then confesses to Donnelly that the story about kangaroo is made up, but it proves her point. So, some people's interests don't get represented, even in democracies. And another potential problem is turnout. The turnout for the Brexit referendum was 72%. Remember, that's 72% of people who are allowed to vote, which may not be the same thing as the number of people who should be allowed to vote. But regardless, there are about 66 million people in the UK and about 47 million registered voters. So 47 over 66, that's about 71.2% of the population who are legally allowed to vote. The turnout for the Brexit referendum was 72%, so that's